Welcome. Exam Prep 7411, 411. So we just did 412. I think a bunch of you were in there. How many were in the 412? Oh, yeah, about half. Did them kind of in reverse order. The difference between 412 and 411 is in 411 we've got a lot more slides. So 412, I know it sounds kind of crazy because I was going kind of fast, but 412 had like 38 slides. This one has 59 slides. And we have the same amount of time. So it's jam-packed full of content. If you see me bouncing around a lot, it's only because I'm watching a clock and I got to make sure to get through all the slides. And then the deck will still maintain the information, a bunch of notes and things like that. So I'm Brian Swittergall. I'm going to be going through this today. I told you guys in the 412, I do a lot of exam item writing. I've been doing that for like 8 years. So I got a good feel for how to make an item, how to look at an OD and test people. And it's the same style that a lot of the other writers use. And I've used all that information I've gleaned over the years to try to put this deck together to get you kind of information for the exam. Not so much necessarily a teaching session. We'll have a little bit of that. It's more of a, here's some stuff that you're going to actually put to use on the exam when you go to take it. So this is the roadmap, server certification, MCSA. The 411 typically comes after the 410, then you take the 412. You guys probably know this, but if not, that would get you your MCSA. And after your MCSA, you can either stop and be happy or move on to MCSE. And you got a few different tracks there. If you guys want more info on that or any of that stuff, down in the Certification Central area, down the hall here, a bunch of MCTs, and we got the roadmaps that you can take with you and stuff like that. Okay, so here's the objectives we're going to be looking at. Deploy, manage, and maintain servers. Configure, file, and print. I won't actually read all these to save time. Pretty evenly distributed. There's quite a bit of Active Directory. If I were to pick out one thing, it's quite a bit of Active Directory. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to talk deploy, manage, and maintain servers. That's a lot of WDS. We're going to talk about patch management and some server monitoring. So let's jump right in. Okay, so this first one, WDS. One of the things we're going to want to know is how to install it, what are the prerequisites. I'll list that stuff, but I won't necessarily read off all these commands. So for WDS, you need ADDS, you need DHCP, DNS, NTFS, the typical stuff. Need to be an administrator. That's pretty obvious. On the boot, capture, install, and discover images, these are pretty testable. So a boot image is pretty self-explanatory. You boot up to the boot image, and you can go from there. The capture image is if you have a reference computer, you built it up, and it's exactly how you want it. You want to use that to deploy to everything else. Then you use a capture image. You capture the computer, and from the capture image, you create an install image. And then the install image is the image that you deploy to your clients, right? And then finally would be the discover image. So the discover image is when you have a computer that can't boot to PXE. So that's a really good testable item. That, hey, all your computers are working fine, but you got a few old legacy boxes. They're not booting up right. What can you do? Well, you can do a discovery image, put it into USB, boot up, and then proceed with your installation. Updating images. So see what I got on this. Patching, hot fixes, drivers, and features. The exam's going to cover a little bit of all that stuff. What we're really talking about is when you have your image and it's offline and you need to do some maintenance on it. So you want to be familiar with some of this stuff. And all of that stuff is, most of it's all DISM. And the next slide, we're going to dive into it a little bit more. So besides DISM, there's the old ImageX package manager, OC setup. Those are all deprecated. So if you see those as exam answer choices, steer clear or at least look at them carefully. Make sure that they're still relevant. And then finally, we have some commandlets. So a lot of people just run DISM from the command line, but you can actually do it via PowerShell. Be aware that that they're there because you might know that the answer is DISM, but it's not one of the choices, and then revert back to your PowerShell DISM. So look at those commandlets when you get a chance. All right, slide 202. So updating images. The only thing I'd say here, know the order. You mount the image offline. You add the package or the driver, whatever you're going to do. Do the maintenance. You commit the changes, and then you unmount it. Watch for people unmounting without committing changes. Scenarios that you added the driver, you unmounted it, and you're trying to figure out what happened to the driver. You got to commit the changes. Also watch for, you need to install a driver or a package in an offline image. What should you do? And the answer is, the installation without the mounting. So just be aware of the order. Pretty important. You're not going to probably get much stuff where they list out these long DISM commands and they switch like one backslash to a forward slash or the other way around. Not going to happen, so don't worry about that. And then I think the final thing on this is the January 2014 update of the OD. That was configured driver groups and packages. So if you guys use WDS and you have a couple hundred drivers in there, it becomes very difficult to manage. So you can create driver groups. Say for an EliteBook 8540 driver group, put all the drivers into that one, makes it very easy to manage. So those may be on the exam as well.
I'm sorry, what is OD?
Oh, sorry, objective domain. So when the exam is all based on an objective domain, it's kind of like a blueprint for the areas they're going to test you. And everything we're looking at here, like deploy and manage servers, that's part of the objective domain that they're testing on. All right, brings us to our first example question. You have an existing image that you use to deploy to servers. That means it's an install image. You need to add a package to the image. What should you do first? Yeah, that one's pretty easy. I already gave the answer on that one. All right, C. Jumping into patch management now. We've got to keep it kind of a quick pace. So patch management from this exam's perspective is WSUS. So you're not going to see a bunch of other stuff, config man or any of that stuff. I think I'd say here is DISM Online enable feature. Be aware of the two different ways that's to get that feature going. But let's talk about targeting clients. So the default method for WSUS is based in WSUS server groups, basically. When you first install it, everyone's in one big group. So if you go to patch, they all go down and reboot at the same time. So you create server groups, and you can manually drag and drop your clients into the groups and create different maintenance windows and things like that. That's not very effective when you get into the larger enterprises, right? And that's where the client-side targeting comes in. So the client-side targeting is more automated. You can target, say, OUs, and if a client's in an OU, then it automatically is in a specific group. And when you add new clients to the domain that are in those OUs, they automatically get going. The other side of the coin is you add new clients, and then you have to do manual work on when you're doing the server-side targeting. So from an administrative overhead perspective, you want to always go with the client-side targeting. And then watch for non-domain join clients. So you might be doing all your configuration via GPO, and you got a couple of boxes that aren't patching, they're not part of the domain. What should you do? Well, yeah, you could join the domain. You could do some registry configuration. Synchronization in WSUS groups. So when they say synchronization, that means the WSUS server is going out to get updates, either from the Microsoft Update site or from a parent WSUS server, upstream server. The one thing I'd say for troubleshooting is proxy server issues. You've got to configure that in WSUS if you have a proxy server issue. Firewall issues, you got the Windows firewall running. The basic stuff, troubleshooting, right? And then bits. It uses bits to do the transfer. So if the bit service isn't running or something like that, that'd be a good exam item there. Final thing, clients not showing up in WSUS. So if they're not showing up, they're probably not getting the group policy. And that might go back to they're not joined to the domain, or they don't, they're not in the right OU, whatever it might be. Yeah, or that too. Moving on to monitor servers. So we're talking about the built-in tools, data collector sets, DCS, right? Performance monitor, all the stuff that you would find on a default install of Windows. Be aware that there's 3 different types of collectors. You can do the performance stuff. You can do the event trace stuff. What I recommend everyone do right before they take the exam is at least pop into Performance Monitor, start a DCS, look at the default templates. Just be familiar with what it looks like, where it goes. It literally takes 1 minute, and it goes a long way. Built-in templates I always point these out because of the exam. You need to quickly gather performance metrics on a server, minimize administrative overhead. There's 8 servers. What do? Well, you use the built-in template for the performance. Pretty basic. Okay, and then on alerts and monitor real-time performance. So I think the big thing here is, you can log an event in the event log, and if your monitoring tool picks that up, you might get notified. But the run a task thing is pretty cool from an automation perspective. So when you run a task, you can run a command line, PowerShell, bat file, script of some sort, and it can, clear disk space. It can page out, send an SMS. It can do pretty much anything. So you want to be aware of that. So monitor VMs is an interesting one because if you just read that, it's hard to understand what that means. But monitor VMs it's a new feature for 2012. And what it means is in a failover cluster, you can monitor the services inside of a VM and take action in the cluster based on what's happening, the health state of those services. All right, monitor service 202. Monitor events. I think the WinRM quick config and the WEC-util QC key things to know because you'll probably come across that on the exam at some point. And then we talk about monitoring events. Works in a non-domain environment, but how? So there's that trusted host entry for WinRM, and you can set the trusted host so that it communicates. If they're in the domain, it's already trust by default. When you centralize your log data, be aware that it works over HTTP, and the port is 5985. Probably not going to see the port on the exam. Okay, so let's talk about event subscription. So now you're monitoring events, capturing a bunch of stuff. How do you centralize this stuff? This won't be any System Center stuff like ACS. This will be just the built-in stuff, which we're talking about, event forwarding. And all your events from your Windows servers forward to, say, one central server that you designate. And from there, you can use the Event Viewer to look at all your servers in one console. You can create some filters, do some views, custom views, and minimize administrative overhead. I think the only thing added here was the schedule performance monitoring. This not really a big issue, so I'm going to skip it. Brings us to an example question. So you have a standalone Hyper-V host running 2012. You need to monitor a service on the VMs that the VMs run 2012. What should you do first? The answer is A. Yeah. So that VM monitoring feature requires Server 2012 and the failover clustering. Moving on. So configure file and print. We have some DFS FSRM, file and disk encryption. We're going to do a little deep dive there into some BitLocker stuff. And then advanced audit policies. Okay, so DFS, this is actually a build slide, so we're going to add some graphics as we go. The first thing to realize with DFS is what are the components that are made up in an infrastructure. This is a typical 2-site enterprise, maybe the headquarters on the left, a branch office on the right there. And so the components are file servers, right? Usually more than one. Namespace servers. Namespace servers help you get to the file servers. The namespace servers don't have to be standalone, but they could be. But you can also run it on the file server. That's typically what most people do. So let's walk through like a client accessing a DFS namespace. So step one, they go to the namespace server. They enter the UNC path and they get referred to the namespace server. Step two, the namespace server issues a referral to the client. So in this guy's case, he's got 2 file servers and they both have the same content. And he's got to figure out which one to go to. Well, that's the job of the namespace server, to issue a referral to the client. The thing to know is it'll default to a file server in the same site. And you can do a bunch of configuration around those referrals. One thing you can do is you can say never refer to something out of site. Be aware of those things. And then Step 3, you go to the file server and get your data. To an end user, of course, it all looks the same. They don't know which server they're on. They just see the same data.
You said that it tries to go to the file server on the same site. Is that something that requires you to set up your sites in your Active Directory?
That does tie into Active Directory sites, yes. Hopefully you're already set up there, but if not, that'd be a good troubleshooting scenario for the exam. You know, somebody's not going to the right file server, maybe a subnet site issue. So the one thing I want to talk about too on this DFS stuff is when you first install it, you can choose 2 different configurations. You can do a domain-based namespace, or you can do a standalone namespace. You want to know the difference between those two. The standalone namespace is scalable, goes up to like 50,000 folders. So if you ever get a question that says, hey, you want to do DFS and you need it to scale like really big, that's going to be a standalone namespace. Domain-based namespace is generally what you'll see for most people because it scales plenty and it offers some of the benefits of the domain. So we'll talk a little bit about that. On the other side, it's the same thing. 1, 2, 3. He's got a single file server. There is a referral order that you can do. You can do random lowest cost. And I talked earlier about you can exclude sites altogether. And then once you get a referral, they're cached for 5 minutes. So if you make any changes and you're expecting a client to go somewhere else or whatever, maybe you took a server down for maintenance, you might see a troubleshooting scenario where it's like, hey, what's happening? I'm going to the UNC path and I'm going to a down server. Why isn't DFS working? Well, it's cached. Okay, let's talk about the replication too. That's part of the setup. This particular diagram shows hub and spoke. So we've got 3 servers. The hub is kind of that upper left-hand corner one, and the other 2 are spokes. So hub and spoke is really good for maybe like an HR department that wants to shove down a bunch of material, forms and stuff, and it gets spread out to all the branch offices. So it does a lot of push. That's perfect for hub and spoke. Hub and spoke requires a minimum of 3 servers. So that's just a little trivia for the exam. And the other one is mesh, full mesh. All the servers communicate with all the servers. Everyone's got the same stuff. You don't have the 3 server minimum on that. So DFS replication has a role service. That's how it actually operates and that you have to install. Where do you guys think you install that? Where? File server. And then, I think you guys know this one. Is this a standalone namespace? No, domain. So the easy way to pick that out is if you have the domain name in the UNC path, it's automatically a domain-based namespace. So a standalone namespace would be a host name, a single label, single name host name. Still on DFS. All right, so 3 slides. New features for 2012 R2. This stuff's always testable, all the new stuff, right? 23 commandlets. The namespaces commandlets have been around. The DFS replication commandlets are new. There's 42 of those things. I'm not going to go into much more detail than that. I do want to talk about cloning, because that's going to be big for the exam. It's a newer feature, and cloning plus preceding is going to be big. So when you put up a new DFS server, one of the things you have to do is you need to get the configuration and the data over to the new server. And if you don't do any cloning or preceding, what ends up happening is you just wait. It takes a long time. It's very expensive. Over a slow WAN link or an expensive WAN link, it's not optimal at all. So database cloning allows you to basically export your database. That becomes your clone. You send it over to the other side, and then you import it. So that's kind of the process, 3 steps. The key to remember, though, is that has nothing to do with the DFS data. Because you got all your file server data, and when you do your clone, that doesn't have anything to do with the data. So you actually need to do the preceding. We're going to talk about that next. So the ExamOD, I have a note here that just says the ExamOD actually added clone a DFS database, recover DFS database as an optimized DFS replication as the newest stuff on the OD. All right, so let's talk preceding. Preceding is taking your data and getting it onto the other side. That's pretty much all it is. You can use whatever method you want. You don't have to use one method. There's many methods. Robocopy is one of the most popular ways, but third-party utilities is okay too. I list out some of the typical ones like the mirror, the robocopy mirror. The one thing I will say is that when you're doing preceding and you're doing your cloning and your preceding, you generally don't want users accessing the source. What happens when they access the source is the file hashes change, and then when the data gets to the other side and you run your PowerShell to compare hashes, make sure everything's legit, something's off because the file hashes have changed. And then you got that expensive operations to synchronize the databases again. All right, jumping into FSRM, File Server Resource Manager. Configuring quotas. So hard or soft, that's very testable. A soft quota, you get 100 megs of space, you've used 100, logs an entry in the event log. Hard quota, and you can keep writing after that. Hard quota is you get to 100 and you can't write anymore. Generally, if you're first setting up quotas, you want to go with soft. Minimize user impact, kind of get a feel for who's over and what not. So file screens, let's talk about those for a second here. So file screens, we have a similar situation. You got active or passive file screen. So file screen allows you to say, hey, on the file server, I don't want MP3s, MP4s, JPEGs or whatever, right? You list them out, and they have some built-in templates like media files and stuff like that. But the active-passive is key for the exam. Passive means, hey, we're going to know every time one of these files is written. We're going to log an entry. I can monitor that and get some emails. Active is, hey, you wrote a file like that, and you can't, and it doesn't stick. Beware of the default templates on those, too. And then the reporting, not much to say here, except be aware that it exists. You can do HTML and a bunch of other methods, and there's a bunch of default reports. You can schedule the reports. So they can just show up in your mailbox every week. And then finally, configure file management tasks, very generic. So interesting thing on these ODs, the exam item writers get the topic, configure file management tasks. There's no explanation for it. They have to interpret it and then write items. Same way we have to interpret it when we study. So anyway, sometimes the interpretations in the study material don't match the exam, and then you probably guys run into that before. Okay, so file and disk encryption. We've got quite a bit of content on this. This first part is EFS, really. EFS has been around for a while. I won't spend too much time on it. Then we have a kind of a deep dive in BitLocker, and we have some. We got a build slide over there. EFS recovery agent. You should know what is needed, right? You really need a certificate. You need a recovery certificate. Otherwise, you can't recover the data. Probably still some scenarios on the exam talking about recovering data for EFS. Let's talk about the certificates for managing EFS in BitLocker, how to manage them. You can archive them in the 412. I talked about archiving certificates. And let me see what else I got on this. So yeah, you can back up your BitLocker recovery info to ADDS. The one thing, this is getting a little bit old for the exam, but it did require a schema extension if you weren't on 2008. Okay, so let's talk about BitLocker. I actually have 4 slides on this. First are the new features. BitLocker provisioning, that's, it used to be you deploy your clients and then you enable BitLocker, and it's kind of an expensive operation. Now it's enable BitLocker and then deploy your operating system. So that's key. New for 2012. The other one is the encrypt for used disk space. So you got a 500 gig hard drive, you got 45 gigs of data. The old days, you encrypt the whole thing, takes forever. Now you encrypt the 45 gigs, and it's very, very fast. Support for encrypted hard drives. So the encrypted hard drives are the hardware-based hard drives that have the onboard encryption. What it does is allows you to offload the stuff to the hardware. Not a huge deal today with all the i7s and what have you. So let's see what else we got here. I think we'll move on. So that was some of those features were new to 2012. Now we have new for 8.1 and 2012 R2. So this is device encryption. When we say device, what we mean is like a tablet or one of those computers that you're not sure if it's a tablet or a computer. something like that. It has to support connected standby. Who knows what connected standby is?
It's like a low power usage.
Yeah, it's a low-powered, kind of like a smartphone-style power mode. You stay connected to the internet at all times, but it's using almost no power. So stuff can update in the background. You can pull down app updates and what have you. Your tiles can refresh. So in order to do device encryption, you got to have connected standby.
Is that a new requirement in 8.1 or is that?
Yeah,
Okay, so that's 8.1 level clients only. So if you see an 8.0
correct.
Windows 7 question, then that's.
Exactly. And these connected standby devices are pretty new. There's not very many of them out there. I'm going to skip over the rest of this stuff just for time. Okay, one thing on the BitLocker policies, this is pretty quick. So group policy is the way you configure all of your BitLocker stuff. And it's pretty handy for the exam to pop into the settings because they're all kind of together. You choose your drive encryption method, the cipher strength. You choose whether users can do stuff with the removable drives. You can enforce some policies, high security environments type stuff. The one at the bottom, allow network unlock at startup. That's the one we're going to be doing a deep dive on next. So network unlock, I guess we'll just switch over there. Network unlock, normally if you do a BitLocker encrypted client computer, when you boot up, you can put in a USB drive or you can punch in a password and then you can continue the boot process. The network unlock basically says, hey, if I'm hardwired into the network and I got access to DHCP and WDS, then you're trusted and we're going to just boot up and you won't have to do that other step, that other authentication. Network unlock is a new feature and it has a bunch of requirements. I want to walk through how it works, but the first one that probably stands out to you guys is this WDS server. It's actually a requirement for network unlock. And that's a tricky one. But hearing it one time for me is probably enough to get through the exam on that particular part. So that's our client computer. We got a DHCP server. You already have one of those. And we have a WDS server. And you can see it runs the BitLocker network unlock feature. So you install the feature on your WDS server. WDS has to be there first. And then we have a network unlock certificate. It's basically a private key. And you'll see where that comes in a minute. The client has the public key. So one of the things with network unlock to get it working is you got to distribute that public key to all your clients. And that's going to be your typical method, auto enrollment or any other way. All right, so let's walk through it. So first thing happens is your standard DHCP request. The second one, though, is a little different. It's a vendor-specific DHCP request. It's encrypted, goes over to the WDS server, and the WDS server uses its private key to decrypt that. There's the decryption with the certificate. And from there, you have two options. One, you can bypass this valid subnet thing. This valid subnet thing is an optional feature in network unlock. So normally, if you're hardwired in and you got access to WDS, you're good. But in a high security environment, what you can do is you can say, hey, only certain subnets are allowed to proceed at this point. And you can configure those subnets in a .ini file that sits on the WDS server. And at this point, the process would be, hey, are you on one of those subnets? If you are, you move forward. If you're not, it fails. So let's look at that. So let's talk about the fail first. If it fails, you revert back to your next unlock protection method, like TPM plus PIN, right? If it succeeds, WDS server sends an intermediate key to the client computer. The client computer has its local key, combines it with the intermediate key, sends it over to a TPM. TPM decrypts it, and then you have your unlock key. So that unlock key is the same key you would have if you didn't have a network unlock and you just were punching in your password, right? This is just network unlock, same key. After the unlock key, the volume itself is unlocked, and then you proceed with your standard Windows boot process. To the end user, they don't see anything. That's the beauty of network unlock. So you want to improve the end user experience. Network unlock is great. You can still have the security if you go with the subnets.
Is that like almost like a Pixie boot that you're talking to?
Well, it's like a Pixie boot. I mean, it's DHCP standard boot, but you get the WDS server on the DHCP initial request. Let me see if I have any notes on this.
Yeah, so it talks to the DHCP server. The DHCP server doesn't need to talk to this other server.
Exactly.
So it's got to be dynamic address. It can't be a static address in that.
I don't know about static. That's something I'll have to look up.
You could set a reservation.
Well, a reservation would work for sure. Not sure about the static. All right, I think that's all on network unlock. Brings
WDS is identified in DHCP as a value.
one more time.
Is that where it's getting the WDS?
In DHCP, yeah.
And that's option 66.
Yeah. Brings us to our first example question, and it's a beast. A lot of words here. I'll let you guys tackle away at it for a second. Now, I want to give you one hint. I haven't given you enough information to answer this question yet. But that's what the exam is going to do, right? So you want to combine this and other methods. I'm hearing a couple of answers. I've heard B, C, and D. What about A? All right, so let's look at it. The answer is D. That's a bolded text. You can barely see it up there, I bet. So the key here was they shouldn't see folders that they don't have access to. Who knows what takes care of that? Access-based enumeration, ABE. So the other thing to know is that the Windows Server 2008 mode actually offers increased scalability. We don't really need it here, but it's there. All right, moving on. Advanced audit policies. So we have our regular audit policies. They've been around forever. And then we have our advanced ones. And they sit side by side. If you ever look at them in group policy, they sit side by side. You want to know the difference between them. You want to know which one takes precedence over the other. I'll save you a little bit of time. The advanced audit policy always takes precedence. You configure the same stuff both places. The advanced auditing always wins. You can do advanced audit policy all the way back to Windows Vista. But there's a key with that. On Windows Vista, you couldn't do group policy. So you had to do audit pol. That's why I have audit pol listed up here. It's good to know about audit pol, just even if you see it this one time, that's how you can do advanced audit policies if you can't do group policy. But it's very high administrative overhead, very tough to manage. But it's still valid, totally valid. Global object access auditing, global auditing. So the typical thing that's been on the exam since like 2000, where you go to a folder, you enable auditing for file, and no activity takes place, and you need to go to the group policy to enable the global object auditing. So it's two places. One little tidbit: versions of Windows that can't join a domain can't use advanced audit policies. So. And there won't be any indication of that. Jumping to network services and access.
Maybe there won't be any indication of that.
Well, they just won't get the policy. Whatever it is you configure. There won't be like any errors.
Right? They wouldn't indicate which edition of Windows you're on.
Oh no, they would definitely do that. Just from the DNS, VPN, and direct access. So talk about DNS. There's a ton of information on here, and I have a whole bunch of notes in my slides. Definitely won't have time to cover it all, but I want to talk stub zones and conditional forwarders because they both kind of do the same thing, and you should know what they both do. So let's first define what stub zone is. So a stub zone is a zone that basically points you to the authoritative DNS servers for a specified zone. And the key with the stub zone is that the DNS servers are dynamically managed. So let's contrast that to conditional forwarding. Conditional forwarding is, hey, I want to resolve fabricom.com, and I want to use these particular DNS servers at these IP addresses. Once I configure that, that's static. If they were to change the DNS servers on the other side, my conditional forwarding breaks, or I got to do something, right? But both of these are great for merger acquisition scenarios. You're going to implement a trust. Because if you don't have one of these things, what happens is when I go to try to resolve, say, Fabricom, I'm going to go out to the internet. And then when I come back in, I'm going to be resolving stuff in the DMZ. Probably not the internal AD domain name, right? Probably not resolvable from the internet. Hopefully not. All right, I'm going to keep moving. So DNS records. know how to add them from the command line, DNS command, record add, and then the PowerShell version. And then know the basics, like the quad A record that I list up there. That's an IPv6 A record. And then the zone scavenging, this one's been important on the exam for a long time. You go to set scavenging at the zone level. You wait a few days. All your records are still in there. You're trying to figure out what's going on. You got to go enable it at the server level. And you might see something where it's the other way around. Hey, you just went to the right click. It shows you a screenshot where it says enable scavenging. And it's like, well, why isn't it working? You got to go down to the zone level. So just be aware of that. And then the cleanup dynamic records. So that's the key, not static. You're about to implement, the scavenging, but you got all these static records. What should you do? And convert them to dynamic because they're going to get ruined. Nothing's going to happen to them.
So if it asks you if you want to clean up static records, is that convert them to dynamic, or is that just delete them?
Well, probably delete them. Because not really a good conversion process. But all right, VPN and routing. The two interfaces thing for NAT is key. Troubleshooting scenario would be one interface. You're trying to get NAT going. It's not working. You need two interfaces. The SSTP is kind of a newer thing. So the thing with that is look for stuff on the exam like firewall-friendly VPN. Because that's SSTP. It uses a standard port 443. It uses a standard certificate. So those are the requirements, the certificate 443 on the firewall. Remote download settings for users. So the default, that's the thing on this one is the default. So the default is control through MPS. Well, you might not be using MPS or you may not have it configured. And you might go to AD, users and computers, and start configuring something and wondering what's going on. So be aware of that. And then the new thing added for the OD was a web application proxy and pass-through mode. I won't have time to cover that one today, but at least be aware of that role and what it does and what use cases it has. Okay, so direct access. The big one on this is that it doesn't require PKI anymore. You can use a single NIC card. When direct access first came out, it was almost impossible to get it installed. You needed IPv6 and just a million things, and no one had it. And they've totally simplified it. They've got a nice little wizard that'll just set it up, and like 15 minutes later, you're working. Missing some features, but you're working. Let's see here. So the offline domain join. So this one's pretty cool. You ship out a client computer to a sales guy working at home, and he can actually join the domain via direct access. Offline domain join. Djoin is the command line version. All right, here we go. Another question. Everyone got it? Pretty easy, pretty easy. D may be too easy. We don't know. Probably would have failed the exam entrance process. All right, so network policy infrastructure. We are going to talk about MPS. We talked a tiny bit about it already. But we're really going to be diving a little bit deeper into NAP. We got like 4 slides on that. It's on the exam quite a bit. So the first thing with NPS, there's a bunch of key terms that a lot of people don't know. Access clients, access servers. So who knows what an access server is? It sounds like a server you get access from, right? But it's a VPN or a wireless device, right? Access clients are, of course, laptops. NPS servers, same as Radius servers. NPS proxies, Radius proxies. And then user account databases, Active Directory domain services. But those kind of key terms thrown out in one item can throw some people for a loop. So just get the terms memorized. Let's jump down to Radius accounting. So this is basically logging all the activities taking place And you can go to SQL database, text file, you can go to both simultaneously. The key for the exam is being able to not have an outage. So you look at that bottom bullet. If logging stops at a disk, SQL down, users can't get in. So that's the key. You know, you can set up MPS, it's working fine. A couple months later, all of a sudden it's down. What do? Probably look for disk space issues, look for SQL issues. If you're logged into SQL, SQL could be down. You might have plenty of disk space. So those little key troubleshooting scenarios are handy for the exam. On the policy side, you have connection request policies. You can specify all kinds of stuff about how people can get in, right? What day and time it is, what computer they have, what network they're coming from. So when you're configuring this stuff, like all those policies, you can use NetSH to import them, export them. You can also use a PowerShell command, export MPS configuration for the configuration. That does the whole entire configuration, so if you wanted to rebuild your box. The one thing I'd say is watch for default installation. So there's this encryption option that's enabled by default. It has like 40-bit, 56-bit. It's got all of them enabled. And so a client in a savvy client could negotiate down to the weakest common denominator because it's on by default and presents a security issue. So in a high security environment kind of question, you might look at the default and take off 56 and 40-bit and go to 128 instead. The other thing is ExamOD didn't change at all on this one. So I think what we'll do is we'll dive into NAP, Network Access Protection. It's actually been deprecated. 2012 R2, it's deprecated. And that means it may never appear again, or like Wins, it may stick around forever. All right, so NAP is actually built into Windows, XP, SP3, and newer. The big thing with NAP is it just evaluates you and your client to figure out if you meet the criteria to join the network. And mostly it's, is your firewall on? Is it enabled? Does it have a certain configuration? Do you have antivirus, any spyware? We're going to look at what all it can do on the next slide. And be aware of the roles, too. So the roles are listed at the bottom. The Network Policy Server role, the Health Registration Authority, and then the Health Credential Authorization Protocol. Those are all options when you install NAP. So let's look at what can be checked. So is the firewall installed and enabled? Do you have antivirus installed and running? Microsoft Update Services enabled? And do you have the most recent updates? Anti-spyware, is it running? And are the definitions up to date? So that's not on XP. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So how do you guys think Windows Security Center plays a role in this? Who actually knows what Windows Security Center is? All right, so what role do you think it plays in this whole NAP process?
It reports on every user alert.
So all of the things like the firewall and the antivirus, anti-spyware report into the Security Center. Security Center has a list of whether you're healthy or not healthy. And then NAP actually checks in with the Security Center to figure out if you're healthy. There's no direct communication there. So one of the reasons XP doesn't work on the anti-spyware is because it can't report into the Security Center. Health policy. Okay, so let me see. So on this one, you configure it, let's say you got to have all this stuff turned on and all up to date on the latest. And then what you can decide is how many of these things can you fail or pass to still gain access to the network. Can you pass one? Can you pass them all? You can fail one, or just be aware of those things.
Quick question. So does it matter if the user goes into the security center and says, don't report on me and all this stuff? It goes around.
So an administrative user?
Yeah.
Well, he could.
Will NAP ignore that, just go past that, say, is he healthy?
Well, if Security Center is not available, then NAP doesn't work.
But if you tell the security center, I have a different virus protection, I'll manage it myself.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I think it might be on. No, I don't have it on the other side. So you don't have to use the Microsoft built-in stuff. You can use any antivirus, any anti-spyware, anything, as long as the software reports into the Windows Security Center. Most of them do, but it's something to know.
So basically, if it doesn't report, you can mark the screen in security center, but you still won't get past the...
Well, if you allow one fail, for instance, you're okay. Well, it's still supported and in the 2012 R2 product, deprecated for 2016. All right, so NAP 3 of 4. Fun. So system health validators, SHVs. This is the one where you get down into the weeds with the settings, specific firewall settings, antivirus settings, automatic update settings. And this is also where you decide what happens if they're not compliant. You know, you can let them in anyway and just be notified about it in an event. Or you can say you can't get access to the network at all. Or most common is that you can put them on a remediation network. And on the remediation network, you can have your Windows Update server or antivirus server and get them up to date. You can put a web page up to kind of give them direction, stuff like that. But be aware that there's a remediation setting. There is another one where you can say, hey, if you, say, fail one of these things, you're going to get full network access, but it's going to be time-bound, like an hour. From an exam perspective, it's kind of an interesting one, because if you do that one and then you become compliant in that hour, you still get booted off the network. But then when you reconnect, it's fine.
System health validators don't work on XP.
Windows, the only thing I have there, Windows XP does not have spyware protection settings available. Otherwise, listed under system health validators. I think I already told you what I was going to tell you on that, which is basically the antivirus stuff doesn't.
Anti-spyware.
Yeah, anti-spyware. Thank you.
So would NAP register that as a fail?
Yeah, it would be no data, which is the same as a fail. But normally, what you do with that situation is you would allow a fail. If you got a bunch of XP clients, you probably wouldn't do the anti-spyware stuff. So isolation remediation, we talked about the remediation network. The default network policy has remediation enabled by default. I talked about the troubleshooting URL. That's kind of handy because users generally won't know what the heck is happening. They just can't get to anything, but they have some kind of network, right? And then be aware of NetSH. That one seems to configure everything on the network, right? NAP, NPS, and IP, everything, right? I list a few commands like the tracing for troubleshooting. So one last thing on NAP before we get off this thing. So the NAP enforcement clients, the ones that tell you whether or not you can get on the network and everything, they're disabled by default. So from an exam perspective, you might configure everything and go on and start testing and can't figure out what's going wrong. Well, the enforcement clients need to be enabled. All right, that brings us to Active Directory stuff. This is a pretty easy section because you guys already know all about Active Directory, right? Service authentication. I'm really going to talk about group managed service accounts, a tiny bit about managed service accounts. And virtual accounts, that's new for the OD. Those are pretty worthless. Those are basically managed service accounts, local accounts that are managed, right? You can use them on one box and they're local. And I don't know how many people are running service accounts on local service accounts, but you could use virtuals. So the set SPN thing for the service principal names, the only thing I'd say there is you can't do duplicates anymore in 2012. So if you've got a bunch of administrators always doing duplicates with SPNs, what do you do? Upgrade to 2012. All right.
Is that a valid answer?
Yeah,
Okay.
totally valid. Group managed service accounts, one of two. The next one's a little bit better. It's a nice table. But for this one, just know that the managed service accounts were introduced in 2008 R2. No one ever used them. We'll talk about that on the next slide. And then they came out with the group managed service accounts. The Active Directory schema needs to be updated to 2012. That's huge for the exam. So not supported on everything. So now that we have the group managed, it would be great if we could just put them anywhere, but they're not supported on everything. Watch out for stuff that shows SQL, Exchange, stuff like that. Not supported. PowerShell commandlet for creating a new GMSA, a new AD service account. And the tricky part with that one is that used to create a managed service account, and now it creates a group managed by default. But you can still do both. All right, let's look at this table, because this pretty much is all you need to know. So managed service account, can you use it on multiple hosts? No. Can you use it on a scheduled task? No. IIS? No. Service control manager? No. can't really use it at all. And that's why no one's ever actually used one of those. So group managed service account is actually a lot better. You can see it. You can use it anywhere. So when we say service control manager, we're talking about going into the services MMC, go to the service, the logon authentication portion. You can pop them in right there. I don't think I showed how to do that. But well, when you go in there, just some little tidbit. When you add the service account, you also have to add the password. To avoid that, you put a $sign on the end of the username, and then you can just click OK, and it signifies, hey, I'm a GMSA. Go get the password from Active Directory. And that's where the password is stored on the domain controllers.
So you have to create the account first as a managed service account with a $sign.
You create it without the $sign. When you add it into a service, you use the $sign. And then from there on out, the password's managed. All right. Configure domain controllers. Universal group membership caching. So the one thing to know about this, it's really only useful in large environments, multi-forest, multi-domain environments, because otherwise it doesn't matter. And in those environments, what happens is when you log on, you've got to have a global catalog server. So at a branch office, if you don't have one, you're going over the WAN, and it's expensive and slow, and response times aren't good, user experience is bad. So you can enable it. It may be on the exam still, probably go away at some point. Transfer and seize operations master roles. We're talking about all the FSMO roles. So you can do the transfer is when everything's running good. You go to the GUI, you right click and transfer, and it's all smooth, there's no downtime. The seize is when things are gone and you don't have your roles and you need to seize them. You do that with NTDS util. It's pretty straightforward. But don't be surprised if you saw an item on the exam that wants to walk through all the steps. You ever seen those drag and drop and put them in the right order type questions? This would be perfect for that. I actually got an item right here. So be aware of it. So, and then RODC configure one. Can't upgrade a writable DC to an RODC. That's pretty obvious. But the staged installation is something that's kind of new. So you can configure an RDC to get it shipped out to a site where you don't have any IT people, and a non-domain admin can actually finish the installation. It's totally safe. Got to keep moving. We have very lot of slides here. Domain controller cloning. So what this is that it allows you to basically use a running DC as a template to create a bunch of other DCs on VMs. Never was supported in the past. All kinds of problems crop up, and they put this new attribute on computer objects that allows it to safely clone. So when we talk about prerequisites, PDC emulator on 2012, kind of a weird one, but it's a key because it's a good testable item, right? Destination VM must be the same OS as the source VM. That's pretty obvious. And the steps, I think I list them right there. So you add the source DC to that group, you use that particular command to create the file, export the source VM, and then you import it. Earlier, I think we talked about importing. So if you want to do multiple DCs, you want to make sure to specify the switch that allows you to continue to import it. Otherwise, it's one and done. And then finally, when you go through this process, there is a list of services that are allowed to be cloned. So if your DC is running certain services, you can clone it. If it's running other services, you can't. And as you try to walk through the process, even if you don't know them, it'll warn you about them. And it's sort of like a red flag, and you can go remediate it and then start the process over. I think, you can see DHCP is one of the unsupported ones. You also have third-party services. So let's say you got a third-party service running on a domain controller. You can actually add it to the XML file if you know it to be safe and the vendor supports it. And you can still clone those types
Is there
of...
a PowerShell commandlet for adding to that XML file?
Well, you could do it with PowerShell, but not through a commandlet. It would be, same as modifying a text file, right?
No, but a specific
No.
command for that?
Okay, so maintain Active Directory. Back it up. Active Directory and sysvol wbadmin start system state backup. That includes all your AD stuff. And it includes sysvol as well. Watch out for items that will ask you to back up AD. And choose all that apply, and you're thinking it's a whole bunch of stuff. It might not be. But you won't ever get a choose all that apply that has one answer. Be aware of that. It never has one answer on a choose all that apply. Manage Active Directory offline. You can now stop Active Directory, the service. You can perform some maintenance, and then you can start it back up. Very handy. Not many people are doing that, but you could compact the database, and you can do some database operations, reclaim some white space in the database. Optimizing. You can do that across all the versions. I mean, in the olden days, before you could stop the service, it would be an totally offline thing. Optimize, LDIF, DE, you can kick off a garbage collection process. That frees up some space inside of the database. It runs automatically on a schedule, but in a weird situation where you need to kick it off right now, that'd be the way. And then the whole compact ntds.did file. Everyone's got so much disk space these days, it's not really relevant. I wouldn't do it myself. And then the new topic is configure and restore objects by using the recycle bin. I don't list anything more on that, but you want to be aware of, first, how to add it. We talked earlier about the forest functional level. You want to know how to restore stuff with the recycle bin. You can do it pretty much two ways. ADAC, the Administrative Center, or through PowerShell. I don't know if I talk about that coming up or not, but restore AD object would be your commandlet. Maintain, so metadata cleanup. You got a DC, hardware failed, you ship some new hardware out there, bring it up, and in ADUC and sites and services and everywhere else, you still have that old DC object. What do? That's the metadata cleanup, and that's NTDS util. If you don't do NTDS util, you can go to like sites and services or your domain controllers, you can just start deleting objects. That sometimes works.
Are they going to go over remove lingering objects in the test?
Unlikely.
Okay.
NTDS util snapshot, we talked a little bit about that. I won't dive into that anything more. There's the restore AD object. And there's the way you enable the recycle bin feature, so after you update your force functional level. Final thing would be authoritative versus non-authoritative. I won't spend much time here because, this is the same as it's always been. You restore Bill to the OU, 30 minutes later, he's gone again. What happened? You did a non-authoritative restore, and you needed to do authoritative. So, or you might see a situation where you go through the whole restore process, and it might ask you what the next step is, and it might be the authoritative one, where you mark everything authoritative. Configure account policies. Local user password policies for all those local virtual accounts, right? But no, really just local regular accounts. You can actually link a GPO to OU filled with computer objects and do a policy with the local stuff. Account lockout settings. I think the only thing here, account lockout duration set to 0. Just means the admin has to unlock it. High security environment, what do you set it to? 0. Threshold 0. Never gets locked out. So you got a denial of service. Some guy's locking all your stuff out. You can set it to 0. Problem solved. Until he cracks the passwords. All right, I think we'll move on. We got a few graphics to liven everything up. PSOs, password settings objects. So BFGPP, who knows that acronym? I made it up. So it's before fine-grained password policy. And it's pretty simple, right? You got 3 people, they're different, but they all have the same policy. Not much to see here. Here's after fine-grained password policies. 3 policies, link them to whoever you want. Obviously not, we're going to dive into the process of how you figure out the details. So I think we're going to keep moving. So password settings objects 204. This is one of our kind of deep dive topics. So we're going to walk through a password change for somebody who may or may not have a password settings object. So let's take a look at this. So the first thing that happens during a password change, we find out if there's any directly linked PSOs. A directly linked PSO is a PSO that is set to apply to one user. Doesn't happen often. It's not generally best practice. You'd like to typically use groups, but that's a directly linked PSO. If there's no directly linked PSO, you look if there's an indirectly linked PSO. That's one that applies to a group that the user is a member of. If neither of those is true, you get the default domain policy. Okay. Well, let's say that you do have a directly linked PSO. It is PSO1. That's the PSO you get. End of story. If you have a direct and indirect link, The direct wins. Okay, now let's look if you have an indirectly linked PSO. The first thing we got to find out is if you have one or if you have more than one. If you have one, that's your PSO. Pretty simple, right? Unless you have a direct link PSO as well, then that wouldn't be the case. If you have more than one, then I don't know if you guys can read that, but it's the MSDS password settings precedence attribute. It evaluates that and figures out what the precedence of all the PSOs that are indirectly linked to your user are, and then it determines the lowest precedence. That's your PSO. Question?
I see a lot of people taking pictures of these slides. Are you going to make this deck available on OneDrive?
Yes. The deck will be online within 24 hours. If you want to come up afterwards and just do some USB stuff, give me your email address or whatever, cool. So we evaluate the attribute, figure out which one's the lowest. Now, an interesting one, unlikely to be seen on the exam, is precedence tie. Two PSOs linked to two different groups. What happens?
The lowest mathematical measure?
The GUID, the lowest GUID. And that is an ugly comparison. Really ugly. All right.
How do you directly link a PSO?
You can, well, actually, we're going to talk about that right now. All right, so applying a PSO, right? There's our admin. You can do it GUI or command line. GUI is ADUC, one way. This is one that people don't really realize. Hey, what tool will you use? You're going to link a PSO. ADUC, how do you do that? You navigate to the object, go to the attribute editor, modify the attribute, stick the DN of the password settings object in there manually. It's very ugly. Never choose that as your right answer. And then the other one is ADAC, Administrative Center. So on that one, you actually can browse to the PSO, or from the PSO, you can browse to a user, and then you don't have to worry about DNs and stuff. That's the best way from the GUI side. You can also do command line, Windows PowerShell. Those are the two commandlets. You create the password policy with the top one. You actually apply it with the bottom one. Pretty straightforward. Let me see if I have anything else on these. Oh, yeah, I do have one more thing. LDIF. You can actually apply a password settings object with LDIF. It's very ugly. You create a little text file, 5 lines with a little dash at the end, and then you run the import. Definitely not going to be on the exam. And then finally, yeah, exactly. So PSO is 4.4. This is basically a Git PowerShell. Shows the PSO, what you look for. The thing to see here is that the precedence, the 20 down there, and the applies to. So you can see if a PSO has been directly linked to a user because it'd be in the applies to. That one's a particular group. The rest of that stuff's probably worthless, but be aware of it. Finally, group policy. Processing we'll start with. LSDOU. What's that? Well, that one's good. Yeah, that's what it is. That's the order of the processing. So local, site, domain, OU. Remember this. Link order, first is highest. So if you're ever looking at the GPMC and you got a bunch of GPOs linked to one place and they're in that order, the one at the top is the one that has highest precedence. That's the link order. So block inheritance, nothing above will apply unless the GPO is enforced. That's the key. You want to block inheritance and somebody comes through and overrides your block because they can enforce. But that is possible.
Can a loopback overwrite and enforce?
No. We're actually going to talk about loopback, but that's next slide. Enforced policies, yeah, we talked about that a little bit. Yeah, so this is one little tidbit. Enforced GPOs also ensure that the settings aren't overwritten by GPOs lower in the structure. You've got conflicting settings. Even though LSDOU normally applies, when you do an enforce, it switches that. The force group policy updates new on the OD. Go to the GPMC, navigate to the OU structure, right-click, force group policy update. And all the computers check in and do their update. Very straightforward. Maybe they'll do a command line, make it a little harder. And then policy processing 202. So security filtering, WMI filtering. I'm going to skip over that. You guys kind of know about that. We're going to talk about loopback processing. So loopback processing is used on kiosk computers, training computers, call centers, stuff like that, where you want everybody that uses the computers to get the same settings. And oftentimes with all the GPOs around, you're not sure if that's going to happen. That's when you enable loopback. And when you do enable loopback, you got two modes, replace and merge. So replace ensures that basically only the computer settings always win. Any of the user settings that are linked to the computers always win. The ones linked to the users, they don't even get applied at all. So that's replace. Merge is where they all get applied. And so is that a draw? They all get applied. Is that like a draw? Exactly. So what happens is when they both apply, the user stuff applies first, computer comes second, so the computer always wins. That's why I said is it. So keep moving. Group policy settings, folder redirection, scripts, administrative templates. I think these are pretty old, probably don't want to spend too much time. Assign to user, assign to computer, publish to user, can't publish to a computer. Yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say on this one. Let's talk about GPOs in general. All the PowerShell stuff, backup, GPO, import, copy, and restore. You should be aware of those. The migration table. You want to take a bunch of GPOs and you want to migrate them to another domain. The migration table editor is the tool. And basically, you can open it up and you can import your GPO that you want to migrate over. And it'll take some of the settings like UNC paths and domain names that are inserted somewhere in your GPO, convert them as like a little transform, so that way they just come across without any modifications. Very handy, and you definitely want to be aware of that. And then finally, reset default GPOs. Your domain's host or your consultant go out to a site and everything's just really trashed. How do you just revert everything back? When I say everything, default domain policy, default domain controllers policy to default. That's that DC GPO fix. Let's see, group policy creator owners. All right, we're going to keep moving. Group policy preferences. I think on this one, the tattooing stuff. So you have a preference, you apply something, you decide you don't want it anymore. The settings are still out there. How do you get rid of them? Well, you reverse the setting and you actually apply it, and then you get rid of the GPO stuff. Item level targeting, that's kind of a new one. That's where you can have a single GPO apply different settings to different computers or users. So normally you'd take two GPOs to do that, but item level targeting, it's like WMI filters and stuff that you can go in there and target whatever you want, laptops or something like that. All right, example question. All right, let's take a look at this. D, to be enforced. I think I just said that a couple slides ago. Enforce always wins. Okay, so I've got a couple more minutes. I got two books to give out, and they are for the 7411, the exam ref books. They're pretty good. They're pretty short. You can probably read them in like 3 days, or not. A few resources. So I think we'll do a little trivia to give away these books. That's what I did last session. One of the questions was way too easy. All right, so let's think.
It would actually be E266.
Yeah, I shouldn't have given those away. Oh yeah, man, I need that. Okay, max length of a password in Windows 2000.
132 characters.
128. Did you get it too? I'll owe you one. All right, final question. How many characters does your password have to be before it stops storing the password hash? 15. Yeah, 15. You got it. All right, guys, that pretty much wraps things up. We got a few minutes. If you have any questions, you want to come up and chat for a couple minutes, grab a copy of the slides or whatever. They will be online in 24 hours, so unless you need them immediately, go that route.